everybody to our 17th annual Armchair Traveler series, and this is our second in the 6-part series for the 2024 season. So we are so excited to have everybody come here today. It is a big year. It is the anniversary of the 250th anniversary of the Edenton Tea Party. And this year, as Miss Lucy was saying, we figured we'd make it a little bit special, harken back to the past a little bit, do influencers of the album era, talking about the people, places, and things that influence this area of the world and kind of make up who we are today. And we figured that worked very well with the idea of looking back at the birth of our nation and all the people involved with it, especially with the Edenton ladies and their contributions to the American Revolution. So tonight, we're going to dive into a local landmark that we all know and love and we see every day, and it's very exciting. We're going to be talking about the Cupola House tonight. The Cupola House Association has come by to talk about the history of the Cupola House from its inception to the present day, and most excitingly, and it kind of is, fortuitous or kind of coincidental, that happening on the anniversary of the 250th is also the restoration of the original woodwork for the Cupola House, which we are very, very excited about. And I'm sure you're excited to hear more about it. And again, before I fully introduce everybody, I want to thank the Friends of the Library very much for helping sponsor this event and all the events that we have going on at the library. We do a lot here on the staff, but the Friends of the Library really help us reach you guys and provide programs. I encourage you that if you are not already a friend, you don't have to, but if you'd like, support the library, support the Friends, become a friend. We like friends. We like to have a lot of friends, so come, become a friend of ours. So, without any further ado, let me introduce Miss Vanna O'Neill and Mr. Jonathan Tobias. Welcome, come on up.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Some of you know I'm a preacher's kid, and my dad served about 50, 60 years behind the pulpit, and he always gave me some advice about timing during a speech. He said, "Jonathan, you don't have to care if people look at your watch during your speech, but what you should mind is when they start doing something like this." I have to be mindful of the clock because the better part of this presentation is going to be done by Miss Vanna, who's going to talk about the history of the Cupola House from 1918 to the present and also beyond. That is the exciting part of our presentation tonight. The Cupola House was designated as a national landmark in 1971, and it was built in 1758 by Francis Corbin, and it is something of a miracle because there are many reasons why this building that you see displayed right to my right, there's many reasons why this building may not have survived. It stands today as a national testament to local dedication and grassroots preservation. This beautiful structure is the most studied building in colonial North Carolina and the most impressive instance of Jacobean architecture south of Massachusetts. It's rightly been called one of the most distinctive and important dwellings of its period in the South. And as with most miracles, the Cupola House has been the stuff of many legends, not to mention the ghost story that we connect with the children's room on the second floor. There was a time in the 1800s when the Cupola House was called the Eden House, because at that time it was generally believed that it had been the residence of Governor Charles Eden. The four Bond sisters, while rightly claiming that the house was built in 1758 by Francis Corbin, also said that Corbin built it for his betrothed, who's back in England, who Miss Tilly as, quote, a young lady with a beautiful name, Jean June. of the North Carolina colony held its sessions in the Cupola House, and on one auspicious occasion, the sisters said, the actual Prince of Wales danced a minuet in the first floor hall with a certain Miss Singleton. Legends appear and legends fade. Francis Corbin's only known marriage was to Jean Innes in 1761, and unfortunately there is no record that the colonial government ever met in Edenton after the capital moved to New Bern in 1741. Neither is there any record of the Prince of Wales ever visiting Edenton. Mr. John Collins kindly notes that Miss Tilly may have embroidered the history of the Cupola House, and I cannot think of a more gentlemanly, courteous word. You all know the Southey map of Edenton from 1769, and I'd like to point out where the Cupola House is in that map, so we're going to zoom in a little bit. And there it is. Notice, by the way, that at that time in 1769, look where the harbor comes up to present Water Street today.
Wow.
And there had been a wharf stretching down. We think it might have been built by Corbin himself. Probably the most enduring legend behind the Cupola House was the prevailing belief until 1993 that the Cupola House was built around 1725 by Richard Sanderson Jr. From this time onward, every deed of Lot 1, where the Cupola House is situated, every deed acknowledges the presence of a house on the property. From this mention of a dwelling, it was long inferred that the structure must refer to the present-day Cupola House itself. This despite the fact that Sanderson later sold that property for only £100. In his unbeatable historical report on the Cupola House written in 1980, Bruce Cheeseman concurred with Elizabeth Van Moore that while the external structure was built by Sanderson, the internal woodwork was fabricated and installed by Francis Corbin in 1758 as part of his renovation of an already existing house. Cheeseman and Miss Van Moore both interpreted the famous FC 1758 finial that you can see on the arch of the second floor above the entrance. They interpreted that as indicating not the construction date, but the date of Corbin's renovation of the Cupola House, along with new outbuildings in the front lot and the completion of a wharf extending from the southern edge of Lot 1 into Edenton Bay, which at that time, as I said already, came up to Water Street itself. That said, Cheeseman acknowledged the local tradition held by the Bond sisters, whom he called spinsters. That's his term, not mine. And others, holding that Francis, quote, Francis Corbin raised the earlier Richard Sanderson dwelling and did indeed build the Cupola House in the years 1756 to 1758. Perhaps exploring this theory, he said it might be supposed that the Jacobean exterior that would have been outdated by the 1750s can be explained by Corbin's personal preference. And it seems that most studies of the remarkable interior woodwork also concluded, along with Cheeseman, that it was fabricated and installed in Corbin's era. In his work on American interiors, Mr. Marvin Schwartz suggested that the designs of the door frames and the pediments surmounting the mantels stem from a Palladian pattern book by William Salmon in 1748. And the Brooklyn Museum agreed with this dating of the interior woodwork. In a 1979 interview with Bruce Cheeseman, Brooklyn curator Donald Pierce expressed this rather pointed, if not rather trenchant, opinion of the woodwork slated on his 5th floor at the Brooklyn Museum. I have to thank my friend Don Jordan for underlining that in red. This is what Mr. Pierce said. In concept, the woodwork is sophisticated, copying contemporary English interior architecture and designs. The squished execution, however, note that word squished, reflects not only the lack of sophisticated craftsmen in Edenton, but also the determination of a pretentious owner anxious to squeeze grand paneling into a structure unsuitable to accommodate the scale. Ouch. This might be what Mr. Pierce was referring to. That's kind of familiar to us all who've been there. We'll have more to say about that dubious term, squished execution. Cheeseman concluded that, quote, the surviving historical sources for Francis Corbin and the dwelling unfortunately don't provide a documented answer to this most ambiguous situation, and a thorough structural analysis and competent foundation and under-the-house archaeological investigation seems to be the only means to at least narrow the various possibilities, if not provide a documented answer. Well, since Cheeseman's report in 1980, some analyses and investigations have been done. Most significant was the verification of the Cupola House construction date by dendrochronology. In 1992, Dr. H.J. Heikkinen reported that the yellow pine used in framing the house came from trees felled in the winter of 1757, while the finished work was completed with wood felled in 1759. Well, so it turns out then that the old local tradition held by the Bond sisters was correct. The FC 1758 finial did in fact advertise the construction date of the house and its builder. The old-fashioned Jacobean exterior and the more contemporary Georgian interior were constructed in the same time period. Now, as to the identity of the actual builder of the Cupola House in 1758, there's little, if any, real information. There may be something to the fact that 2 years after Corbin's estate sale, a certain Edenton carpenter by the name of Robert Kershaw in 1770 filed a suit against Corbin's widow, Jean Innes Corbin, seeking to recover £600. Cheeseman suggested that this charge was from the remodeling work that Corbin ordered in 1758, but as we've seen, the house was built then, not before, and since Kershaw is not known as a master craftsman like Samuel Black, and that he was probably an illiterate man who lived in inns and went from job to job, it is a possibility that Kershaw's bill was for work done on the external structure of the house. That's the best I can give. As it is with the ongoing work of history and preservation, some legends fall, some survive, and more mysteries emerge and remain. Here's a few questions. Like, why did Corbin choose an out-of-date Jacobean style for the exterior? Also, why is the interior woodwork so ostentatious and opulent? As the Brooklyn curator complained, as grand paneling squeezed into an unsuitable space. Is this a mistake? Or is this a function of Francis Corbin's egoistic, self-promoting personality? Might be true. Was Corbin so egocentric that his pretentious whims resulted in pediments protruding inches into the ceiling in the dining room, the hall, and even in the master bedroom? That last mystery, I think, will have to wait until the reinstallation project, which will require the removal of the present reconstructed woodwork to prepare for the placement of the original. I can't wait, because that dismantling should yield hopefully some answers to these mysterious questions. Speaking of the woodwork, which is going to be of such intense interest in the next year, one remaining mystery may have already yielded some new clues. Several years ago, our own Don Jordan, Tom Newbern, and Jim Melchor put forth some remarkable propositions. There are exact matches between, on one hand, the architectural carvings in the walls, the fireplace mantels, the arches over the doors, and the stair spandrels, and on the other hand, the furniture carvings on the famous Edenton armchairs and other furnishings known to have been part of Corbin's inventory at the Cupola house. As you can see in some of these matches here, the same gouge used on the Edenton armchair and in the rosettes along the stairway. They conclude that these many exact matches indicate that, quote, the same carver executed both the Edenton armchairs as well as the Cupola house carving, along with other pieces from the Corbin inventory. They go on to state that this level of craftsmanship was unprecedented in the entire area in Edenton and could only be attributed to the arrival of talented cabinet maker Samuel Black, who arrived in Edenton probably from Scotland in 1758 during the construction of the Cupola house. And there you can see those chairs reconstructed by Don Jordan, by the way. You can see them as an example of the master craftsman work done by the Cupola house carver. How did Samuel Black get here? Perhaps he was invited by Corbin. That may be, but what is known is that this master carver, because of his unmatched abilities in this area, he was the only craftsman, the only carver who was able to rise and enter by marriage into the higher social ranks of the community. About Francis Corbin, there are some things that are known but not enough. Was Corbin the scurrilous mountebank who regularly skimmed money from funds collected for his sponsor, Lord Granville? Probably not. There's not a shred of evidence that he ever did so. Was he completely devoted to the interests of Lord Granville? Again, probably not. I think it can be safely said, quoting Judge Tom Newbern, that, quote, Corbin was more loyal to Corbin than to Lord Granville. Speaking of Lord Granville, Francis Corbin came to North Carolina in 1749 as the land agent for John Carteret, Lord Granville, who was the last of the Lords Proprietors of the English crown. King Charles II had granted much of North and South Carolina to 8 Lords Proprietors in 1663 for their support of him during the English Civil War. Kind of gives you an idea about some of the proprietorships in North and South Carolina. In the 1750s, Lord Granville instructed Francis Corbin to build a proper land office in Edenton in which he could conduct Granville's business and store records in one location. The building was to serve also as a commodious apartment for Corbin whenever he was in town to conduct business for Granville. for the Granville Land Agency. As we can see, Corbin took the word commodious to heart and put on a pretty liberal interpretation of that word when he purchased this lot of land in 1756 and built the present structure. Although, ironically, he made the purchase of the land lot and built the house not under the name of Lord Granville, but under his own. Kind of gives you an idea about how Francis Corbin operated. It was to be a townhouse and a public house where business could be transacted and lavish dinners could be given. Edenton at that time was one of the most important seaports on the Atlantic seaboard, and this house was meant to demonstrate the dignity of the English crown. Its imposing architecture and interior were meant to impress onlookers and visitors. The best interior carvings, paint, and the best furnishings were procured to impress and intimidate local guests and possibly to welcome the visit of Lord Granville himself, should he ever decide to visit his proprietorship, although that never did occur. It is said, though, that Corbin was popular about town. Accordingly, he was elected by the freeholders of Chowan to the General Assembly for 4 consecutive years in the 1760s. He was a faithful vestryman at St. Paul's Church. However, his relationship with North Carolinians west of the Chowan River was less auspicious. It seems that his agents for the Granville Land Agency had become so malfeasant and negligent that on the night of January 24th, 1759, an extra-legal posse of about 20 men from the Edgecombe region seized Corbin at his plantation and forcibly carried him off to his Enfield office some 70 miles away. A little map for you. At that place in Enfield, in his office, he was held under armed guard until he agreed to a number of concessions for land policy reformation. Soon thereafter, Lord Granville, responding to many complaints by Corbin's political opponents, finally dismissed Corbin from his service on April 25th, 1759. But remember, he held title to that lot, didn't he? And he owned that house, so he didn't get kicked out. Corbin remained in town as a public official, and then in 1761 he married Mrs. Jean Innes, who was the widow of his buddy Colonel James Innes, and from that time on he spent much of his remaining life at her large plantation, Point Pleasant, which was situated on a magnificent bluff overlooking the Cape Fear River. Francis Corbin died in 1767 and is buried at Point Pleasant. His family sold the furnishings of the Cupola house a year later. Many of the possessions were purchased by old families of Edenton, where they remain to this day. Some of the buyers at the estate sale are familiar names: Samuel Johnston from Hayes, Joseph Blunt from Mulberry Hill, Daniel Earl, or rather Reverend Daniel Earl from Bandon, and from Edenton, Jasper Carleton, George Blair, and the young Thomas Hodgson, who is the son of Penelope Barker's first marriage, and my hero, Joseph Hughes himself. They were all at that sale. After a decade of rentals, the house itself was finally purchased in 1777 by Dr. Samuel Dickinson, an outstanding physician from Hartford, Connecticut. He had just married Elizabeth Eelbeck Ormond, a wealthy widow, niece of the famous Penelope Barker and one of the signers of the Edenton Tea Resolves. The Dickinson family would remain in the Cupola house for the next 141 years. They had 8 children, most of whom died young, with only 3 surviving childhood. Dr. Dickinson involved himself in a number of business ventures, including the maritime trade, in which he made use of the Cupola House wharf, and significantly he became a partner in the notable Lake Company, with Josiah Collins and Nathaniel Allen. The main object of the lake company was to drain wetlands by cutting a canal through the unremitting and often deadly labor of hundreds of enslaved African workers who were all set to digging out a canal from Lake Phelps about 6 miles to the Scuppernong River. After a successful medical practice and a series of business ventures whose results were, let's just say, mixed at best, Dr. Dickinson died in 1802, and he was followed in decease by Mrs. Elizabeth Dickinson in 1819. One of their daughters was Penelope Barker Dickinson, who's better known as Penny, and she married the successful Edentonian merchant Nathaniel Bond in 1809. He was the one who added the front porch to the cupola house and replaced the original rusticated siding with the present clapboard siding, except for the cupola itself. It appears that he finished the interior of the northwest room on the first floor with Federal-style molding. Either he or maybe his father-in-law finished the room above it. Prior to this, Corbin seemed to have intended that room's use as a place to store business records and archives, and today you can see it as the children's room where we have our ghost story. If you haven't heard that ghost story, come see me in one of my tours. At some time during the Dickinson and Bond era, a 2-story detached brick kitchen was erected in 1885. The Sanborn Fire Insurance map showed the presence of this structure. And there it is, right there. And there's a shed right behind it. This seems to have been a replacement of an earlier detached wooden kitchen from Corbin's era, which was indicated on Southier's 1769 plan of Edenton that I showed you at the beginning. The brick structure must have been taken down prior to 1893 because the Sanborn map of that year shows only that wooden shed still standing. This structure had disappeared. Nathaniel and Penelope Bond had 4 daughters and 2 sons. The daughters never married and continued to live in the cupola house. Their older son, Alexander, married Sarah Simpson and became the mayor of Edenton after the Civil War, but remained childless. The younger son, Joseph, became a Baptist minister in Georgia. After the death of his wife in the 1880s, he returned to the cupola house with his daughter, Matilda Penelope Tilly Bond. Nathaniel Bond passed away in 1855. Penny followed him in 1865. And over the latter decades of the 1800s, the only occupants of this once lavish and luxurious house were the unmarried elderly daughters of Nathaniel and Penelope Bond that the Edenton newspaper called the Old Maids of Edenton. Again, that's the paper's choice, not mine. And their niece Tilly. There was no income except for an occasional boarder, and so hard financial necessity drove them to begin selling off their family's furnishings along with parcels of the original lot. Where we see the gardens, and beautiful gardens in the front, eventually became a Goodyear tire dealership in 1920, and you'll see that photo later on, Jay, so just don't worry. And what is now the herb garden in the back became a firehouse shortly before 1927. Doesn't look at all like it does today, does it? The end finally came in 1918, which you will hear about in Miss Vanna's presentation. This is a poignant miracle. It is the one legend that has come true. In 1918, in the immediate aftermath of World War I, no one was interested in preservation. The house was unpainted and ungainly and had fallen into a dilapidated state. It was possible, and we need to take this serious, it was possible at that time for even this house, never mind its grand history, to be razed to the ground to make way for more modern construction. Or maybe just left as an empty, melancholy lot. Y'all remember that old ruined house that George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life threw a rock into to try to impress his girlfriend Mary Hatch? Remember that? But, like what George and Mary Bailey did with that fictional house, the new Cupola House Association took this real house and ever since, in the last years, has devoted time and treasure to make it shine again. What you see now as the historic gem situated at the heart of beautiful Edenton is nothing short of a miracle, the stuff of true legend, the golden fruit of an ongoing local grassroots endeavor. Now I'm going to give you in much better hands.
First of all, can you hear me? Okay, I won't use the mic then, but I will use my glasses. Let's see. You've heard all these horror stories. I received a document from well, it was in the files. J.H. McMullen wrote Edentonia in 1932. It was advanced age when this was written, but I thought it was important to tell you, to set the ambiance of the town in the 1900s so we can kind of set the stage here. He said, Edenton was at that time one of the most isolated towns in America. It was almost impossible to go any distance by highway because of their miserable condition, poor bridges, deep sand, mud, and whatnot. We only had one train a day, which ran from Edenton to Norfolk. We had no communication other than by boat with points across the Chelan River and the Albemarle Sound. We did have 4 or 5 large boats which in their leisurely manner plied all contiguous waters. And so outside news was real news to us, and we welcomed its broadcasting by the well-informed traveling men of the day under the old mulberry tree each evening. So they gathered under the old mulberry tree. There were 3 significant fires in Edenton, but the Cheapside fire dramatically changed the look of the downtown area. A lamp that overheated was said to have taken down all of the wooden colonial structures of the southeast side of Broad Street, then Main Street. But the Cupola House continued to stand, a miracle. What followed in 1918 was the end of World War I and a pandemic. Sound familiar? Desperate times call for desperate measures. And this is Miss Tilly Bond. She was the last of the descendants of the Dickinson era. Imagine being so cold, hungry, and desperate that you had to resort to selling all of your last assets, the elaborate 1758 Cupola House woodwork, including the front and back doors, to pay your bills. I have many times tried to even imagine selling my front and back door to my house. That's desperate. The house was in disrepair, unpainted, and the grounds overgrown, as you've seen. Tilly Bond, being the last descendant of the Dickinson Bond family in the Cupola House, exercised this option in 1918 with an antiques dealer who recognized the value of the unique woodwork when he was purchasing many of the family treasures from her. A representative from the Brooklyn Museum thought it was perfect for a new display of period rooms. That's what it looked like. It's pretty desperate, doesn't it? Further deterioration. It's really heartening, disheartening. On February 11th in 1918, this is a guest book that has remained in the Cupola House. Miss Tilly Bond, being the last resident, as I said, welcomed three gentlemen who came to the house to purchase some of the precious antiques. The gentlemen were Andrew Royf, assistant curator of the Brooklyn Museum, and antiques dealer Albert Collins of New York City, and N.T. Howland of Baltimore. That day, they offered Miss Tilly to purchase the exquisite woodwork. They began to mark the woodwork. If this was a clearer picture, you could see there are numbers on all of the panels, which talked about it being like the southeast room, the northeast room, the southwest, the northwest room. And you can see from right here, Tilly Bond was probably living in this room and the room behind it, which was a bedroom at the time. But this was her source of heat. There's no kitchen in there either, so she perhaps even cooked on the unit that was in this room. To the horror of the local townspeople, when they witnessed the removal of the first floor woodwork and realized this was a threat of losing an important part of their heritage, they immediately rallied to form an organization to save the Cupola house. Overnight, they met and raised the funds to purchase the house and grounds, as well as the second and third floor woodwork, including the staircase. This Herculean effort is the earliest known community preservation movement in North Carolina to save a historic structure. A miracle indeed. Your theme right now is influencers of the Albemarle. So I'm asking you a question, who were these founders of the Cupola House Association? They were the movers and shakers of the first quarter of the 20th century in Edenton. At least 4 served as mayors of Edenton. 4 were children of Caroline and Edward Wood, owner of Hayes. 4 owned and operated fisheries on the Albemarle Sound. Thomas Harrison Shepard owned one at Long Beach in Chowan County. William Rhodes Capehart Jr. owned one at Avoca, Bertie County. Frank Wood of Greenfield in Chowan County owned another one. And Henry Gillum Wood at Sandy Point owned yet another one. 3 were medical doctors. McMullen Sr., Richard Dillard, Charles Casey. Frank Fred Muth, of which some of you may even have some of the homes that he designed here in town, is a local architect, and he was later a consultant at the Brooklyn Museum. He built several of their homes. Several were investors in the Edenton Cotton Mill and/or the Edenton Peanut Mill. Frank Wood, John Gillum Wood Sr., Henry Gillum Wood, William Shepard-Pruden Sr., Thomas Harrison Shepard, Charles Spurgeon Van, Louis Ziegler, James Norfleet Pruden, Miles Gilbert Brown, M.G. Brown, which was M.G. Brown Manufacturing, which you shop there today, the Kellogg space. In fact, it took up more than that area at that point in time. And Cameron Shepard Graham. Louis Ziegler ran a successful undertaking business and furniture business on South Broad Street. He had the house at 108 North Broad Street, which is now the Edenton Visitor Center. It's painted very bright colors, and it is painted very bright colors again. Reverend Robert Brent Drain was the rector at St. Paul's Episcopal Church for 56 years. Charles Spurgeon Van held 2 public offices at one time, and he was sued for doing so. I think there are some of those today as well. Most of the founders of the Cupola House Association are buried in Chowan County, either at St. Paul's Churchyard or at Beaver Hill Cemetery. Anne Cameron Shepard Graham and Thomas Harrison Shepard were half-siblings. Their father was William Blunt Shepard, who lived at Wessington. A couple of years later, they were the founders of the Shepard-Pruden Memorial Library in 1921. Thomas Harrison Shepard and his wife Marion Bowden Shepard, Ann Cameron Shepard Graham, and Annie Wood Pruden and her stepson, James Norfleet Pruden, worked to found the Shepard-Pruden Memorial Library in memory of William Blunt Shepard and William Dawsey Pruden Sr. Big connection between this library and the Cupola House. There was an article in the newspaper at the time, which you can't read, so I deciphered it. It said, the headline was, "To preserve a historic landmark in Edenton. Ancient Cupola House to be maintained as a library and museum. The Cupola House, built in Edenton in pre-revolutionary days, and in which many notable events in colonial times in the state took place, will be preserved as a museum and library. The Secretary of State yesterday chartered the Cupola House Library and Museum of Edenton for that purpose, with an authorized capital stock of $50,000, and $4,500 of that was paid by Mr. and Mrs. Frank Wood and H.G. Wood and others in Edenton." I looked up how much that was in today's dollars. It's over $106,000 in today's dollars. The same year, in 1920, just a month later, on July, another article appeared. Some of the patriotic folks of Edenton have made the Cupola House a museum, which they have arranged to preserve, and which will care for the historic building and the contents that will be gathered in it. It is one of the old structures of the ancient capital and associated with the neighborhood, and is so much in the early story and tradition of the colony and the state of North Carolina that we are all under a debt to those who are taking care of the building and the memories that it will house. They further went on to say, Edenton was the center of activity in the beginning of the settlement. It was the home of governors until the Revolutionary period had begun to show the approaching threats, and even after that had given a new aspect to the life of the colonies. Edenton continued to have its powerful representation in the movements that ultimately led to the freedom and the establishment of the State of the Union. At the very end of this article, it's probably one of the most important things that they had to say. The town, prominent for more than 2 centuries in the annals of the state, deserves to be preserved in every way that it can. For not only North Carolinians, but Americans from all quarters will one day delight to read the records as they were written there on the sound and in the forming days of the United States. It's a profound statement. If I were to write this article today, I of course would draw attention to the statement of how strong women influenced Edenton in this area, beginning with the 51 women in 1774. However, when this became a library and a museum, many of the prominent ladies in Edenton were the first librarians. They managed a tea room over there, and they endeavored to maintain the historic papers and files. Also, now, when that was written, said we had survived 2 centuries. Well, now we've survived 3 centuries, and how glorious Edenton is at this point. There's your favorite picture. Where are you? Imagine selling 10 feet in front of your front door and 10 feet in back of your back door to survive. Today it's difficult to imagine how compromised the Cupola House and Gardens were, as the property had been sold off by the Bond family previously, and the Goodyear building was erected, and then the firehouse in the back. The property lines, as I said, were within 10 feet. This is near and dear to your heart. This is a picture of Anne McMullen Jones, who was a librarian in the Cupola House in the 1940s. The library museum continued in the Cupola House until the 1960s, when the current library started construction. The association began to purchase the grounds to restore the property once again to its former glory and install its splendid gardens. In 1964, 60 years ago, to this year. The president of the Cupola House Association at that time, David Warren, wrote a heartfelt note on this piece of yellow legal paper here, asking the Brooklyn Museum to return this exquisite woodwork to the Cupola House before they started the arduous task of recreating it. What came back to them, you see there's a lot of letters, a lot of correspondence back and forth. This matter has been given much thought, and we regret to decline the request to acquire the paneling. Since the acquisition was made many years ago, the rooms from Edenton have served an important purpose here at the museum, where close to 1 million people a year are given the opportunity of seeing them. We feel it is of the utmost importance, therefore, to retain this paneling. Hooray. Anyway, so fast forward 60 years. In January, actually in 59 years, in January of 2023, there was a delegation from the Cupola House Association that went to the Brooklyn Museum with the express purpose of asking for the woodwork back one more time. We felt it was a single chance to ask for that, as we had heard that they were recipients of $50 million to recreate those period rooms and turn it into a modern art gallery. I've seen some of that modern art that they're starting to put back in there, and it's not my taste, but they felt during COVID that they were no longer relevant. So they said, well, we've got $50 million, we're going to get rid of these beautiful period rooms. How wonderful for us. We went up there with the purpose of asking them to give it back to us because we did not have the money to purchase it. We left with a gentleman's handshake, and they said, yes, we intend to give it back to you. Miracle of miracles. A memorandum of understanding was signed in May of 2024 by the Brooklyn Museum and the Cupola House for the return of the prized woodwork. A task force committee was formed this year. The group went to work to lay out the logistics of handling the return of the woodwork and development of a long-term strategy to bring the property back to how it would have functioned in the 1700s. Contracts were signed with Ralph Harvard to oversee the removal, labeling, and transport of the woodwork for phase 1. Local contractor Andrew Owenby and Wade Rogers will be on site in Brooklyn. Actually, they're going up this week to plan logistics and during the key times of removal, and will manage and organizing the materials in the we've rented a 4,400 square foot warehouse here to store the woodwork when it comes back. Removal will begin next month, October. It will take approximately 3 weeks to get it out, to deinstall it, and 2 semi-trucks will come into town. We had talked about maybe having a parade, we just don't know when it's going to be, so it's kind of difficult, but we're going to do our best to do that. We're currently interviewing companies to provide services to provide a documentary of the Cupola House history, and have applied for 2 grants to help fund that, and hope to have local participation as well in funding that important endeavor. We will conduct hard hat tours in the Cupola House because we will have to close in January of 2025 for a period of time. We understand there's a great deal of interest with hard hat tours as people get to see the bones of this magnificent structure. So we're expecting a lot of interest in that. This is a time when there's a great learning experience, and one we hope will further endear the Cupola House Association to everyone. As part of the overall strategy, we are planning to put the detached 2-story wooden frame kitchen back in tandem as we do these other things. This is some of the pictures of the woodwork that I neglected to show you. That's a present day picture of the woodwork in Brooklyn today. These pictures were taken a couple of months ago, and they've done the elevation studies for us as well. They had already removed the furnishings. That's how it looks, and that's what's coming back to us. This is part of the overall strategy that we're planning to put the the kitchen back, because when we start our work over there, we will no longer have a restroom or a sort of kitchen over there. So we'd like to put a two-story detached wooden frame kitchen back in tandem with the woodwork project. So what we think is going to happen here, we will get 12 windows back that are period appropriate. The originals are in the Cupola house. With the 12 period appropriate windows, we would endeavor to put in this two-story, it's an imagination here, imagined construction. But we would use those 12 windows in this building. We would use the floorboards that are coming back from Brooklyn, because the original floorings in the Cupola house. We would reuse that. We would take off the clapboard siding from the Cupola house when we get the money and put the rusticated siding back on there. You can see evidence of that in the Cupola, as Jonathan told you. The whole house looked like that. We would take the clapboards and put them on the kitchen. This is a preservation story. It's a great story that we're telling about reuse, repurpose of these materials. Other projects in the near future include replacing our fence, which is rotting daily. There was a picket found in a home as a bracing piece of wood in one of the old houses here. And so we're planning to put this up here now. And one is, you can see it beforehand. This is what's there today. And these were some other ideas, but this is that. And that's what we're planning on putting back to surround the Cupola house when funds are available. And they will be built by a local contractor. When the woodwork is back in place, the Cupola house will hold the distinction of being one of the only structures of its era to be able to put back the original elements due to the continued preservation efforts over the last 106 years. Other structures no longer exist. They can't take their woodwork back from these period rooms in Brooklyn. The Cupola house is certainly a miracle on Broad Street. Thank you.
Do we have any questions that want to get?
What's going to happen to the reproduction woodwork that's in there now?
Yeah. Who asked? Oh, we will plan to monetize that. My woodwork task force, which meets every 2 weeks, will come up with a plan for that. We'll do an auction, which is probably the best way to do it.
Okay.
There are so many layers of paint on the original woodwork that it will be removed to this storage space that I talked about, so that they can begin to take the paint off, because Humpty Dumpty's not going to go back together again with all that paint in there.
Okay.
Other questions?
Okay. The woodwork that was redone in the 60s was done by local people.
Right.
And amongst them was Susan's mother.
Right.
Who did the rosettes.
Right.
When I was up, Frances was up on the second floor with me one day. I asked her, because that pediment thing has always driven me crazy. And I thought maybe it was because it wasn't as important a room, and so they were just not paying as much attention. So I asked her if, when they redid things, if they had gone up there, and she said, no, we were very curious ourselves. We went up there was no sign of the pediment being covered over. That's always been like that. That it wasn't,
When this woodwork is taken down, there, as Jonathan stated, there are many mysteries that are going to be uncovered here.
But this is upstairs. This is that
Upstairs.
master bedroom upstairs where the pediment kind of goes.
Yes, I
over.
know what you're talking about, yeah.
And that kind of thing, it would be neat to make sure stays in kind of a way, since we know that really was there the whole time. And also, have you found anything more about the walk around.
Oh, well, that's the other plan that I didn't talk about, and the Widow's Walk. There's been, we have some great materials over at the Cupola House that were discovered in the eaves to put the Widow's Walk back around. Tilly Bond had alluded to that in her little pamphlet, and we always, just kind of dismissed that. But as the years went on, they found these support pieces, and they saw the ghosting. They said, okay, she was right. They did serve tea up there around the cupola
And he
on the
found,
Widow's Walk.
he found the doorway, the doorway.
Right, there was a doorway out there to the, yes. Yeah.
I asked lots of
Other
questions.
questions? Uh-huh.
I wanted to ask, after the woodwork is here, and they start putting it, taking it out and putting it in, will there be an opportunity for volunteer woodworkers to work with Wade and Anna?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
I just wondered.
Yeah. But you bring up an important question. Thornberry Wood, who's, his mother was Virginia Wood, and his sister lives here now, Flora. He's been doing research for me on the descendants of the founders, and he's had a great time doing that. So as a result of that, we plan on we started talking about doing a Founders Day, but as you uncover more and more of this, we said maybe it should be a couple of days so that we really celebrate these people that took the risk in 1918 and put that money out there and saved this beautiful structure. Downtown would be totally different if the Cupola House didn't stand there today. So we're going to celebrate
They
that.
saw Francis's brother-in-law saw it being taken out and said, and they couldn't do anything about the first story, but the rest of it.
Right. Yeah.
What was the original color of the woodwork?
The woodwork?
Yes, that's coming back.
Okay. Well, as far as we know, it's that Prussian blue that you see. But we also have just signed papers to have Susan Buck, who's world-renowned for her paint analysis. I mean, she does this, microscopic work. In fact, she's the reason that the Cupola House is painted the color it is today, because she discovered in her work in 2018, those were the original colors, and she did analysis upstairs. They did a paint analysis in Brooklyn in the 1930s, but we have much better equipment today to do that analysis work, and so we're going to avail ourselves of that. She is so excited. This is her last project before she retires. So she will actually go to the warehouse, and she'll be looking to see if there's any pieces of wallpaper or anything like that. Because typically, from what I've read on some of her papers, she said you would have really colorful wallpaper, and then the woodwork would be a white. Any other questions? That's about all the answers I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming by and telling us about what's going on at the Cupola House and the history, as well as what to expect in the near future. Thank you so much. Another round of applause. Well, this is the conclusion of tonight's program, but that does not mean it's the end of the Armchair Traveler series. In fact, we got 4 more coming up. So I invite you next week to come here to learn about the Petticoat Patriots of this region, where we have a local woman over on the Outer Banks who rode around like Paul Revere and warned that the British were coming, or the British regulars were coming, and helped prepare the defenses of the local militia to put up North Carolina's defense during the early days of the American Revolution. And also we get to hear about a famous woman in Virginia who spied on the British soldiers and Cornwallis as they worked their way towards Yorktown, and informed the Marquis de Lafayette of their arrival, and eventually cornered them into Yorktown and ending the war in 1781. These are strong women patriots who made a difference in our country, And we're having Miss Libby McNamee, a author of YA literature who writes all about this in her book series. And we invite you to come here next week to learn all about that. So thank you so much. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next week.
Oh, yeah, look at the-